Hi, folks. It's going to be a good, intimate session here, and I'm not going to try to take up the entire damn hour unless you really want to dig into some conversational questions that I'm posing at the end here. So, just briefly, this is my research question. Really, what it comes down to is I want to find out whether or not people who want to buy an apartment really care about their energy and emissions of their apartment and energy costs, those kinds of things. And it was a fair journey to get here. This actually is about the 8th iteration of my research question. And it'll probably iterate again a couple more times. But I think I'm zeroing in on really one of the, and focus on what it is that I really want to do and whether or not it actually is going to have some impact. So why should we care? Well, in Toronto and Vancouver, buildings emissions are about 30 to 40% of the emissions from the city. And primarily that's from domestic hot water consumption and heating, to some extent cooling, but also, of course, from depending upon the electricity source, where that is coming from as well. So this is some data from New York City, which was one of the first municipalities in the States that brought in a benchmarking regulation. And here you can see for multifamily buildings, the multifamily energy use intensities, that there's a whole bunch of outliers out here. And the range is huge. It's about 7 to 1 in terms of energy consumption per square foot. So the choices that you make when you're trying to buy your home could make a real difference as to whether or not you're going to be, what your personal carbon footprint is going to be. And for that matter, with any luck down the road, it might impact what happens, what the costs are that you pay for your apartment. What the New York City found was that if they actually reduced the energy consumption of their worst performing buildings down just to that of the median, that they could have some really serious energy and greenhouse gas emission savings. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping is actually going to play out. We'll see as it shows out across Canada. So you buy a car, and there's an EnerGuide sticker in the back. You've got some information as to how much your fuel costs are likely to be. If you buy a refrigerator, you've got the same thing. You've got an EnerGuide sticker that tells you just where it sits relative to where that particular appliance sits relative to similar products. But buildings are orders of magnitude more energy costs, greenhouse gas emissions. And at the moment in Canada, you don't have the right to this information, except in a very few places. And that's likely to change. We'll see. As usual, Europe was way ahead of of North America. Almost 15 years ago, the Building Energy Performance Directive came in Europe 2002. And it was required for all buildings and to be released to the people who are buying or leasing the building at the time of transaction. And that's been operating now and is right across the EU with some 34 nations. But they had to recast it in 2010, and because they found that it wasn't working as effectively as they thought it should. And what they changed was that they now require that this information is disclosed in any marketing and sales information for people who want to buy or lease a building, and that they're now pulling this data into national databases because it was pretty scattered in terms of where the information was held, and people didn't know where to get it if they knew it existed in the first place. Building energy benchmarking and labeling is now spreading right across the world. I mean, of course, in the EU and Germany, but as well in probably one of the most successful is in Australia, the Neighbours program. Even China has now got a mandatory building energy labeling requirement. North America's been a bit slower for that. Though right across the States now for the past 10 years, there have been a huge number, some 15 odd municipalities, the largest cities in the States now are requiring building energy benchmarking is the terminology that's being used in North America, including 2 states, Washington and California. California was the first state to bring it in on the entire state basis. Interestingly, they pulled back, and this year they're revamping their regulation pretty seriously. And I'll be talking about some of the reasons behind that in a minute. Canada's been slow to the table, but in 2014, the City of Toronto and the City of Vancouver both proposed mandatory benchmarking reporting and public disclosure regulations, and staff have been working on that since. That's now been upped to the provincial level, because energy in Canada is provincial jurisdiction, and particularly with regard to the getting the energy data from the energy utilities, that's something that typically utility regulators have to, and utility commissions have to be doing. So now both Ontario and British Columbia are considering bringing in regulations across these provinces that again require annual reporting of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and associated characteristics of the building. That's probably going to be part of the discussions over the course of this year. As you may know, in March, the first ministers of the provinces and for that matter, the federal government are going to be getting together to talk about Canada's greenhouse gas and climate change strategy. And with any luck, benchmarking is going to be one of the conversations that they're going to be having behind closed doors. So it raises a whole bunch of policy issues. It sounds like a simple concept, and it is, but like everything else that's probably worth doing, the devil is in the details. So, what's the scope? What kinds of buildings should be covered by these regulations? How big should they be? Small ones, big ones, very large ones. How much capacity is there in the industry to actually report this information? You'd be surprised how many buildings have no idea how much energy consumption, how much they spent on energy last year. And, the data quality. If people are inexperienced in benchmarking their data, this is probably going to be something that we got to be paying attention to as we're starting to build massive databases on these things. When should that information be reported and disclosed? Should it be only at time of transaction? Should it be annually? Should this data always be available? How do you ensure that people are actually going to be complying with the regulation in the first place? And how are you going to encourage people or discourage them from not complying with the law? And of course, there's always the question of costs. But I think one of the most interesting things about benchmarking regulations, some of the biggest issues first, utilities have a real problem with reporting this information on a building scale. So think about it. For one thing, if you start digging into it, the definition of a building is not really all that clear. And in any building, like a condominium or an office, in many cases, there's one meter that serves the heating or cooling, serves the common areas of the building, but each individual owner or each individual tenant's got their own electricity meter. That means that you've got to collect all this information and aggregate it at the building scale. And this is not something that utilities do right now, what they deal with account holders. That leads to some other issues. Privacy. Do people want their energy consumption disclosed? And that's been one of the reasons that California had to pull back on its regulation. And of course, it leads to some other issues, such as, well, if we're going to make this data public, in what formats are we going to do this? How is this information going to be presented to people so it's actually useful to them? Well, there's a bunch of anticipated benefits from transparency from making this data public. For once, we're actually going to have maybe some real numbers, some real data to actually inform policy, because right now, the Canadian building energy statistics are based on the residuals. So, right now, we don't know how much buildings actually use in terms of energy consumption, because what we do is we measure everything else, and we measure we collect what was sold, and everything else the difference between them is attributed to buildings, because we don't have good information. Benchmarking regulations is going to change that, and that will help building owners actually manage their buildings better, because they'll actually have a better understanding as to where their building operates and functions and costs, relative to the population of similar other buildings, which at the moment they don't have. I think one of the biggest issues right now, and policy issues, is whether or not this information is going to actually inform the market failure that we have. Because people, when they're making some of the biggest investment decisions, with buying or selling a building or leasing some space either for your home or for your office, at the moment don't know what their energy is, what their greenhouse gas emissions are, and as a result, they can't factor that into their decisions. And if we end up with a serious price on carbon, then that's going to be a real problem. What it can do, potential, is to really bolster the market competition. Highlight the buildings and the building owners that are actually managing their buildings well. And of course, show up the laggards, the ones that aren't doing all that well, and maybe they're not being managed all that well, and maybe you don't want to be buying that building or leasing some space in it. That's likely to spur some investment in retrofits and improving building performance. That's the general hope. And of course, along with that comes green jobs and skills, which is of course important to us, but certainly politicians, and whether or not they're going to get re-elected. Turns out that greening buildings is probably one of the most job-intensive things that you can do. And what's more, retrofits of buildings and construction is a job that you simply cannot export. You got to actually be there to put these things together. So, first question I had as I started diving into this literature review is, is benchmarking regulations, are they effective? And frankly, this is not an easy problem to solve. It's not an easy question to understand, to really resolve. Again, New York City has been doing this now for about 4 years, and the tool that's being used across North America has been Energy Star Portfolio Manager. This is a free web tool that is offered by the U.S. EPA, and it's got a lot of the hard work nailed down in terms of how you benchmark a building, how you normalize them so they're comparable, and makes it pretty easy for basically anybody who can actually use a spreadsheet, or for that matter, just use a computer to actually benchmark their building. And EPA asked that same question: is it effective? A couple of years ago, and the short answer is that, yeah, we think so, but maybe not all that effective. It certainly isn't a game changer. We're not talking a silver bullet. There's a whole bunch of things, factors that go into the decision as to whether or not you're going to retrofit a building, or whether you're going to put a fair bit of money into making it energy efficient in the first construction. But benchmarking seems to, from their studies, have some impact. What's more, it's the foundation of data that allows you to actually understand where your building sits relative to others. So their study was 35,000 buildings. The portfolio manager now has got probably the largest database of buildings in the world at this point. That those buildings that actually did benchmark had a little bit of actual energy savings and energy cost savings, more to the point for people who are cutting the checks. And over the course of 3 years, had 7% actual cumulative savings. So, yeah, it sounds like there's actually some effect, but how much is attributable specifically to the benchmarking regulations is not a methodological problem. New York City actually ran these numbers along with EPA. They came up with a protocol to really get down to isolating the impacts of benchmarking regulations. I think it has, some improvement to do. But on the source energy side, they ran the numbers over the course of the first 3 years of New York City's benchmarking data, and in fact there was a trend of savings. Not a lot, but it was there. When you take a look at the greenhouse gas emissions, similarly, there is a trend towards savings, a little bit stronger than the source energy. And their conclusion was that while you can't necessarily attribute them just to benchmarking alone, that at least the findings that they had from real data are consistent with the idea that benchmarking actually does have some sort of impact. So, from the European experience, the Europeans, the European Commission, went and took a look at their data as well, just fairly recently. They just published a report in 2012. And what they found was that, yes, there was an impact, particularly, but it was pretty small. And there are some real flaws within the way that the energy performance certificates and the directive were implemented across the different nation states of the EU. And in particular, that what information and when it was presented was probably one of the most important things that the initial certificates didn't capture. So this is what an EU certificate looks like. So you can see here we've got an A to G grade. A is the most energy efficient. The certificate shows on the top right there the CO2 emissions over the course of the last few years, and what its operational rating is, how much energy consumed, a bit more detail. The portfolio manager certificate, the energy performance certificate, doesn't go with the A to G grade. Instead, what it has is a 0 to 100. So this is the ranking of this building relative to the population of similar buildings. So if you're at 77, then you're doing better than 77% of the similar buildings. It's got, the site energy use intensity, the energy consumption per square foot. It's got some greenhouse gas emissions that are estimated. It's got a bunch of information. What's missing from these is what matters most to most people, which is how much it costs. I mean, greenhouse gas emissions are invisible. Who cares about a kilowatt hour? Does anybody know what a kilogram of greenhouse gas emissions looks like? If you were here last Halloween, you might have. But the point is that what people really care about is how much does it cost me in a month, right? That's something that literally hits people in the pocketbook. But these certificates don't tell you that. So, back to my research question. It raises a whole bunch of other research questions besides my primary one. The first one is, does anybody care? Right? That's the main question that I want to answer. But there's a few others that I think are important. Like first, I think that putting this information into multiple listing websites when people are trying to buy a condo is a good place to intervene. But in that case, do the real estate market conditions matter? Does it make a difference? Does it make a difference into what people's decisions are likely to be? What information do people want to have? Do they really care about what their actual greenhouse gas emissions are in the course of a year? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know yet. And if people do want some information, what forms is it best? What forms do they find valuable in terms of having this information presented to them? And so that's what my thesis is focused on. And my research approach, I'll tell you, this is probably one of the most difficult problems that I've had to wrestle with, is, what methodology am I going to be approaching this at? And I've come down to grounded theory largely because it's one in which you actually seek the answers from your data. And I've got an engineering background, data first, and let's get some lessons out of that. And it goes through, you code your data, you develop some concepts out of those, you cluster them, etc., and you develop your theory out of that. And one of the things that really, to me, is attractive about grounding theory is that you carry on with gathering data until things don't diverge anymore, until you've run out of surprises. That said, I'm having real difficulties with the particular methodologies, the details of the methodology, and particularly given that I have to say I'm an advocate. I think I'm an actor in this conversation, and so I've had to really figure out, and will no doubt continue to figure out, how I can set aside my advocacy position so that I can put on the research hat and actually put out credible research that is meaningful, that isn't just dismissed as something that's coming from somebody who's got an axe to grind. And one thing about the engaged theory is that you're doing ongoing literature review. And that's one thing that from my understanding of the grounded theory is that it doesn't really go there. And so I'm trying to mix these two. And yeah, I'd like some help with some of these conversations down the road if you're interested. So, as I say, I'm focused on putting together, intervening at the key points when providing information might actually make a difference to people. And there are two. One is when people are doing their market research as to what it is that they see their market as doing. But I think the most important one is probably when they're actually sitting down and trying to look at and decide what candidates they want to be taking a look at. And to that end, how many here have actually bought a home besides me? 3. Okay. Right. So the first thing you do is you figure out, well, how much can I afford? And how many bedrooms do I want? How many baths, that kind of thing. You've got the whole list of serious first order criteria. Where do I want to live? How many bedrooms do I need? Do I want a roof that leaks or not? Right? Energy is way down the list. But what can I afford in terms of a mortgage? But more to the point, what can I afford in terms of my monthly payments for having a roof over my head? Now that's going to be for your mortgage. It's going to be for your taxes. It's going to be for an apartment, the condo fees, but it's also the utility costs are going to be part of that picture. And as I say, at this point, there's some gaps there. The main tool that people use to do this, besides hiring an agent, a real estate agent, is this multiple listing services website, realtor.ca. It's run by the Canadian Real Estate Association. And it shows the different places and different condos that you can get in downtown Vancouver here. It's got a GIS interface, and it gives some basic information about some of those condos. When you click on one of those, then you get more detailed information. You get a description of the place. You get some clickable photos. What's of interest here is that it shows a walk score. And walk score is a tool that has been put out by an ENGO in the States that indicates just how walkable your neighborhood is. Can you go and you buy milk at the corner? Can you actually have a good doctor nearby? And this is all about transportation, and particularly about the environmental impacts of transportation. But there is no corresponding information at this point about the energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions about the building itself. And that's, I think, one of the things that could really make a difference. And so to that end, my thesis is focused on how we can bring that information, hopefully, into the Canadian, the realtor.ca, the Canadian Real Estate Association's website that they offer for people to use. So, strata fees, right? Now those strata fees are not just maintenance fees typically. In fact, typically they're the cost of your hot water, and in many cases the heating. So that's wrapped into the strata fee, as well as the maintenance. And sometimes, that's right. Yeah. But if you're buying a condo, you will almost certainly have your own electricity meter, and so you'll have your own bill coming monthly. But the heating costs, and in some cases, if you've got an air conditioning and your domestic hot water costs, they're going to be wrapped into your strata fee in most cases. So there's 3 different ways that I've been thinking about getting at this. I mean, I have to say I've got an agenda here. I think that it would be really good if realtor.ca carried this information about energy and greenhouse gas emissions. But this is the real world, or quasi the real world as I'm in school, and I have limited resources. So I came up with 3 different approaches to actually get to carry out my research and gather this data. I mean, the ideal case that I worked with the Canadian Real Estate Association, and we do basically a market test with a little adjunct of Realtor.ca. That has some issues with it. For one thing, it's expensive. For another, working with another partner, particularly an organizational partner, an industry association partner, has got some political issues and certainly some responsiveness issues. And the Canadian Real Estate Association, or the Ontario Real Estate Association, was one of the main opposition to actually bringing in home energy labeling in Ontario in the early days of the conversations of the Ontario's Green Energy Act. So that may or may not be a good thing, but I've come to the conclusion that I have to speak with them. I have to try that first and see whether or not they will partner with us to see whether or not this is information that they want the Realtor.ca to provide to people. The next step down is to get permission from CREA to use their data, but build a Chrome application that actually that provides a similar kind of functionality. In both these cases, I'd like to start off with doing a survey of the people who are using it, so the condo buyers, people who are actually in the process of buying a condo, and find out who they are, what their concerns are, what their priorities are, what their criteria are for buying a place. Sit them down with this demonstration, have them use it. You'll learn from it. With any luck, they'll stumble across the energy consumption, greenhouse gas information that I've now injected into this site. They play with it for a little while, and then an exit interview, which covers much of the same ground, but sees whether or not providing this information is going to actually affected their decisions, and whether or not they're going to decide whether or not to go and take a look at the open house or go and visit that apartment. So that's a little bit cheaper. I've been doing some investigation to have help with that. Website developers to develop this separate application. It looks like an Android app, and scraping data from the Realtor.ca, and it looks like it's a little bit cheaper, maybe, but it's certainly not going to be a trivial exercise. What may be more doable is to just sit down, do a demonstration and a mock-up, and work with individual people who are trying to buy an apartment, and walk through that information using this, walk through their experience using Realtor.ca, and providing the information, that the energy and greenhouse gas information in the course of that. Again, with an opening interview and a closing interview to gather the data that I need. So that's basically my presentation. I'd like to really thank Ray Cole, who've worked with for a long time, and the balance of my thesis committee, because they certainly helped me clarify my thinking. And I have to thank Gunilla and others here, because I found that your course, in terms of trying to write a thesis proposal, helped me a lot. So I have some questions for you folks. First, am I dreaming in tech?